Hello, I'm Matt Lavery. This is the first of 11 videos prepared for the P3 Data Summit for 2017. I'm going to be, in these videos, displaying some of the features of pivot tables as well as some general features of Excel to help us analyze our data. And for these demonstrations, I'll be using a scrubbed version of the 2017 P3 dataset. All identifying information has been replaced with random IDs, and all of the high schools have been numbered in random order so as to obscure which high school is which. So as I go through this data, we're going to be doing a lot of work in pivot tables. The data files that you have already have a pivot table created, but I wanted to demonstrate quickly how to set up a pivot table in case you find them useful and want to use them in other projects. So in order to set up a pivot table, the first thing we'll do is click somewhere in the data. As long as the active cell is within the data, it'll work. We go up to the Insert menu and we click on Pivot Table. By the way, throughout this video, the red circles will indicate that I've made a regular click, a left click, and if those circles are blue, like this, that will indicate a left click or a right click. So it automatically finds the edges of our data. You'll see that here in the table range, and it's automatically going to put this pivot table on a new worksheet, which is by far the most convenient way to do that. So we'll just leave everything the way it is and click OK. Now, you can see that over here, this is the area in which the pivot table will show up. And down the right side of the screen is the area in which you work with the fields to set up how the pivot table is going to look. Now, I'm going to drag this tab here, double click so I can change its name, and I'll just call this pivot table. And now that resembles what you should see in your data set. To make the data display like it currently looks in your data set, we'll take the university and the cohort across the top, so university in rows, cohort in columns. Whatever you drag into the rows box will come over here and become your rows, and then it searches for all the unique values to figure out how many rows or columns to set up for that data. And I'm going to take the P3 ID and drag that into the values box. Because that is a text value, it's going to, by default, count them. And so this shows that in the large data set, there are 5,042 students. Your data sets will only have the students that come from your high school, so those numbers will be smaller. But as I'm working through these examples, you can compare your own findings to the full group to see where you stand there. Now, just to finish orienting you to pivot tables, I can actually grab any of these fields here in the fields list, and all of these fields are described in your data dictionary. And I can drag them to any of these boxes, and more than one can go in there. For example, I can drag cohort here below the university, and you'll see it will group everything by university first and then the cohorts within. Or if I drag cohort above the university, then it'll be grouped by year with the universities together within. And so we'll be using a lot of these features to change what our data looks like. Another thing that we can do as well is right-click this, or click this. Another way that we can sort of modify the way our data presents is we can click these downward arrows next to the field in the pivot table fields sidebar. Let me try that again. So another way that we can modify how the pivot table appears to us is we can click these downward arrows next to the field in the pivot table fields sidebar, and that downward arrow gives me some options. I'm going to go to value field settings. That'll give me this dialog box. Now, because this cell holds a text value, the only one that actually makes sense is count, but we can also add up the values in the cells. If they were numeric, we could average them, we could report the max, the minimum, the product. So there's lots of different things here that we can report about that data. We can also name it here, but another thing that can be very useful is this Show Values As tab. If we click that, we can do some calculations on those values. So, for example, if we go to % of grand total, click OK. Now it's going to put 100% here in the grand total, and then every single cell shows the % of records in that cell. Now, that's actually a little bit counterintuitive, because that means that 6.5% of the students in the entire data set went to BGSU in 2010. It's not exactly a useful way to break that down. So if we go back to that cell, we could do % of column total. Now this lets us know that in 2010, 43% of the students in this data set went to BGSU, and 56% of the students in this data set went to University of Toledo. Actually, 57. And so the way that you set those Show Values As selections will determine how it gets calculated after it's loaded into the field. And we'll see how useful that can be in some of the examples to come. So that concludes this first video, and as we move forward, we'll be going through the questions that appear in your Questions to Ask of Your Data document, and we'll be demonstrating some of the fantastic features of pivot tables.